Hello, everyone. This is Cash Miller. I'm the host of Marketing Masters and the CEO of Titan Digital. Today, I've got with me Sara Lohse, favorite daughter media. Yes, she really thinks she's her father's favorite. It leads to arguments at the house, I'm told. We're going to be talking about podcasting today and how you can use it to really build brand awareness for your company. Sara, it's great to have you on. Tell us a little bit about what you do in your company.
Thank you so much for having me. I am the favorite daughter. My company is really focused on building thought leadership and building brands through thought leadership avenues like podcasting and podcast guesting. I help people figure out their stories, refine those stories, and use them to elevate themselves as thought leaders, whether they want to speak at events or be on podcasts, launch their own show, publish books, whatever it is, help them really figure out how to hone that message and lead with personal stories and that personal value.
Okay, that's great. Let's, first, let's have our audience understand like how big podcasting has really become. Because we see podcasts, or listen to podcasts all over the place, and there's so many different topics and things, so just so that they understand like the opportunity that's here. How big is it?
Podcasting is huge. It's one of the fastest growing medias right now, and it is my favorite media. It's seems to be a common misconception that podcasting is oversaturated because everybody has a podcast or everyone is launching a podcast, but it's actually really interesting if you look at it. There's far fewer podcasts out there than say like YouTube channels,
Oh yeah.
and people don't see that as being oversaturated. There, everyone wants to have a YouTube channel.
Hmm.
But if you actually think about it, all of these podcasts that get launched, so many people, we call it in the industry pod fade. So
Yeah.
they start a podcast and they don't make it past episode 7, episode 10. So, yes, all of these podcasts have been started, but it's a much smaller number for podcasts that are actually active and putting out content.
Yeah, there's like, and you can really see this through some of the guesting sites that exist, because whenever you're looking to be a guest, you're going to look at the podcast and see when the latest episode was and things like that. And you really do see how many have like dropped off. They did, yeah, 6, 7 episodes, maybe 20 or something over a couple of years, but it can be a hard thing to stick to, if you're going to use it as a strategy, just because of, you've got content or, creation, or you're bringing on guests, production, side of things to actually produce the episodes. There's a number of, factors that go into it to make it successful. So it's not as oversaturated, and your comparison to YouTube is, really, um, you know, spot on because, yeah, you never seem to have enough YouTube channels. So why can't there be, more podcasts?
Yeah, and then it also goes down to niches, and there might be 100,000 podcasts, but how many of them are talking about the topic you talk about, and how many of
Hmm.
them are aimed at your very specific audience? So
Yeah.
I think it was John Lee Dumas who said, niche down until it hurts. So the farther you niche, the less there is in that space, the less white noise, the less competition.
Yeah. I think, and in some cases, I've talked to a few guests that do podcasts of their own. Sometimes a podcast isn't necessarily meant to go on forever for that
Mhm.
particular type because of the topic itself. Like you say, if you take a niche down and you're looking at, okay, hey, we're talking about this, how much can you talk about that? So, one of the things that can be considered is doing like limited series podcasts, for that, and then maybe you pivot and you come up with another topic so that as a host you become known, but you segment into different series and such and promote them. There's like a lot of different things you could actually do. So, like, for one, I have a question. Do you have a podcast?
I do. I have a podcast. It's relatively new. We launched in June. It is called Branded, and it is a comprehensive guide to creative branding. So we talk all about how to build your personal brand and everything that goes into it, and then how you can use that personal brand or your professional brand to really grow as a person, as a creator, as a professional, and use it to elevate yourself as a thought leader.
Well, there you go. Because okay, so if we talk about how do you find what you should be talking about, like specific categories? Because, like you say, is there anybody in the area you're considering that's really doing anything on the podcasting? So, talk about how a business, if a business owner is thinking of, I want to do a podcast, what should they be considering so that they can be able to bring on guests, they can build an audience over time, so that you have listeners and whatnot. What's going to go into this?
Well, as far as choosing your topic, I kind of have a little slogan that I say, use your outside voice. And when I say that, what I mean is back when we were kids, we would be always told to use our inside voices. But there were those times that we're just so excited, we are bubbling over, we have to just scream about something or we will explode. And we
Mhm.
cannot use that inside voice. That is a kind of excitement and passion I want people to have about the topic they want to have a podcast about. Those topics that you can talk about for hours, the ones that you're with your significant other, someone brings it up and they roll their eyes and say, don't get them started because they'll just keep talking about it. Those are the topics that you really should lean into.
Mhm.
But for a business, kind of a misconception with branded podcasts and podcasts for businesses themselves are that you're supposed to talk about your business. And you're really not.
Yeah.
That's the difference between a podcast and an ad. It's not about your business, it's about what you value. So if like Jeep were to put out a podcast, they probably have one, they wouldn't talk about Jeeps. They would talk about adventure and getting out into the wild, getting off of the paved roads, things that they're really passionate about as a
Mm.
company, things they value. And then it's going to give that connection to their listener. So when they go to buy a car and they're thinking, you know what, I want a car that can help me with going on adventures because that's something I'm passionate about, they're gonna make that connection back to Jeep.
Yeah, that's actually um, a really good example, because in video, you have what's known as a type of video as a brand anthem. And
Mhm,
throughout the brand anthem, it could be Jeep or somebody else, but you see the products, but they never talk about the products. It's always in the moment,
mhm.
so you're out on the adventure, and that's the whole idea, right? Is you're doing the adventure and you just happen to be using this particular product. It could be like there's some like hiking boot brands and stuff that they do that kind of stuff, and camping equipment and whatnot. You don't, the equipment's just kind of part of the set, that they're doing, but it's all about the adventure and getting out there. And you could do podcasts pretty much the same way. If you had a hiking podcast and talking about all the greatest places to go hiking, well, that hiking podcast could be done by I say a hiking footwear company, or like Timberline or something like that. And or it could be camping equipment, whatever it is, but they're the ones that are sponsoring, but they never really talk about the equipment. They just talk about how great it is to go camping in all these like great national forests or something.
Exactly. It all comes down to like the principles in marketing, which you're not marketing a product, you're marketing the end result. So when you're going to start a podcast as a way to market, you're not talking about your company, you're talking about the values and what it can lead to.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's great. So how would you go if you needed, you wanted to do this? How would a company go about exploring, how does it figure, how do you figure out what you're going to want to do? Like, you know, what are some of the tips you would have to figuring out your voice and stuff for it? Because if you're going to do a podcast, that's part of what you're doing, because you're going to use it to amplify everything you're doing.
Yeah, I think the first thing is to really make sure that you have clarity in your branding itself. And that's something that even if you don't want to have a podcast, if you have a brand, you should work on having that brand clarity. And there's a lot that goes into it, but part of it is like, what are your values? What are the things that you want to promise to your audience? So, what are your brand promises? What are your guiding principles? How do you present yourself in a way that's authentic? And when you have that clarity, it's going to lead into what you should be talking about because it's going to be those things that you do value in your mission for your company, what you see for the future.
Okay. Okay. So let's reverse it. Instead of being the host, if you're the guest, because some of what you were just saying would lean into, being a guest. So what's the value in being a guest on podcasts? Because we've kind of established, yeah, there's a bunch of them out there, so why would you want to be a guest? And then how would you go about figuring out where you should be a guest?
Yeah, being a guest on a podcast is really, really great for a marketing plan if you do it the right way. And podcasts are such a unique media because they're built on connection and they're built on trust. So if I'm listening to your podcast every week, I trust you. I trust what you have to say. I
Mm.
believe that you do know what you're talking about and you're a thought leader and an expert on your topic. So if you guest on a podcast, you get to almost capitalize on that trust and that connection that the listeners have with that host. So a host bringing you on their show is almost them recommending you and
Okay.
saying, this is somebody that has a valuable message for my listeners. So
Mm.
you get to use that trust.
All right. So you're tapping in, you're able to, for one, the host is essentially saying, I approve of this person in a way, to their audience. And then you also have that, um, you know, they become trusted if they're, especially if they're appearing on different places. There's a thing in like for content, they have the as seen on,
Mhm.
so as seen on this site and this site and this site, and it'll all be big brands, big companies. And what does it kind of work the same way if you get on the right podcast?
Sort of. I mean, I have it on my website, a featured on with some of the places I've spoken, some of the shows I've been on. But I think it really just comes down to being a really great guest and doing the host justice. So if you are going to capitalize on the trust that they have with their listeners, you don't want to take advantage of that. You want to make sure that you are giving them value and
Mhm.
you're giving the listener something worth listening to and really adding to the show and not making the show about you. So it's not something that should be used as like a sales tactic. You don't want to sell anything on a podcast. You just want to share and tell stories and give value and give information.
Right. So now I've been on a few other podcasts and stuff though, and they end up, some of them, depending on how they're run, they actually do just ask, hey, what about, tell me about your company and tell me about, they have like, is there value in those? Because some of them are kind of fairly standard. It's not like you're not really showing thought leadership. It's almost like an advertisement. Yeah. And so, and you see those, and until you go on, I mean, you can listen to episodes obviously beforehand and see if that's the trend that they use, the way that they go about them. But is there value in those ones? Do they need to be diving deeper, to find other, like better opportunities? Because if you talk about leadership, you want to be able to show off expertise, and in your field, you do want to tell your story to some degree, but it seems like you can end up kind of repeating it from one to another.
Yeah, I think having the same story on different shows is okay because they're being listened to by different people. You're probably the only person who listens to every single podcast that you go on.
That's a good point.
If you do listen to every
Yeah, right.
podcast that you go
Yeah,
on.
right.
So I actually tend to tell people to have a few stories that are their go-tos just
Okay.
to make it easier in the moment because if you don't do this a lot, like it's a very high stress situation for someone that doesn't go on podcasts. So having those stories that you know you can rely on as long as they fit within the conversation. But the podcasts that do feel more like ads, it's not that they're not valuable. It's just a matter of, is this something that you would listen to? So if you listen to a podcast and you think, "Oh, I would never listen to this," don't go on the show. It's you're not gonna have the connection with the
Mm.
host or the connection with the audience that you're looking for. So you want it's kind of like write the book that you wish you could read. Go
Yeah.
on the shows you wanna listen to. Go on the shows that you can really have a good vibe with the host, and it can be a really natural conversation. But with shows that do feel like an ad, there is still value there. If they do have a listenership, you do get to reach it, but you also can repurpose the content. So you can take that and put it on your website or break it into smaller pieces, make it into reels or TikToks or
Mhm.
quote graphics, whatever it is. And you can push that out on your own social. So it's a really good way to get more content, but to really have the best experience as a guest, you want a show that really resonates with you.
Okay, so you mentioned a few things as far as promoting the shows you're on. So let's go into there for a second and say,
Sure.
like, okay, if you're going to be on a podcast, you've gotten the opportunity and such. What are the things you should be prepared? You've got your primary talking points, but from a promotion standpoint, after that, you've been given the links to the episode. What are some of the best practices to maximize the value of the appearance?
Yeah, you want to push it out as much as you can. And the first thing that I do is get it up on my website. I have a blog post for every podcast that I've been on. And I say there's two ways to put a podcast on your website. There's the way that is just sharing the episode and you kind of copy a blurb from the show notes and it's just
Hmm.
here's my episode, here's the content. But you can actually take it a step further, take the conversation and turn it into an actual blog because people are very specific in how they take in media. So
Hmm.
not everyone listens to podcasts. And if you've ever met someone who doesn't listen to podcasts and you suggest they listen to your podcast, they're going to say, thanks, but I don't listen to those. They're not
Yeah.
just going to be like, okay, well, now I listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
So if you can take that content and turn it into a blog, then you're going to reach the audience that doesn't listen but does read. And that's not going to be the same as just the blog with the show notes because show notes aren't really that readable. Show notes are written for robots. They're written for SEO. They're
Yeah.
written to be indexed by Google. You put the transcript. Nobody actually reads the transcript. They're just there for the SEO keywords and for accessibility. But if you actually turn it into a narrative and you just dive into the topics that you talked about, you can still link it to the episode itself,
Hmm.
but that's going to reach a whole different level of audience because not everybody does listen.
Well, what about social media? Promoting things like I recently talked to somebody who runs a platform called Wave, and
Okay.
there it has the ability to create short form. So, say you only have the audio of the podcast, it can create clips that are still tied to the audio, and then you use them as short, like reel videos and stuff on TikTok and things like that. So, what are some of those kinds of things, like that? Are there some other things you could be doing, to be able to, promote that podcast and that episode more? Because I say you're promoting the host and the show, but you're promoting yourself as being on